About 300 years ago, the Jesuit scholar and mathematician Athanasius Kirchhoff attempted to calculate the possible number of combinations into which 50 objects could be placed. The result of his calculation required a total sum running into over 40 figures. Trillions of possible combinations. Now, if we take, instead of 50 different objects, we consider the 3 billion human beings that constitute the approximate population of our Earth, we begin to understand the problem of diversity. Diversity arises from the infinite number of combinations into which a fixed number of objects can be arranged. As we know that each of these fixed objects has, in the case of man, a temperament, a personality, a way of life, that there are many large groupings of attitudes among these objects, people, that are in conflict with each other. And that out of the entire mystery arises the dominant factor that each of this group of objects has an irresistible impulse to dominate all the others and all the possible combinations. We can see that the human being could be a pretty busy creature. These infinite combinations result in the pressures, problems, intensities, attitudes with which we are all concerned, and by which many of us are rather seriously dominated. While we have no evidence that Buddha ever made this exact calculation, he came to the same conclusion that practically all thinkers have come to, namely that the attempt on the part of man to advance his own cause in the term of dominating the world around him is essentially a lost cause. We can extend our knowledge of things, but knowledge does not necessarily imply control. As time goes on, we may explore further into the vastnesses of space about us. But exploration is not control. Regardless of what we do or how we do it, we are moving through a universe which we cannot actually dominate. The most that we can hope to do is to understand it, and through understanding, to make use of certain of its processes to advance the common good of man. We must constantly use or abuse every force or element with which we come in contact. And the end of knowledge probably for us is that we shall come to know right use, and also have the courage and understanding to obey the laws of that right usage, so that we may come into as harmonious an arrangement as possible with the life around us. Realizing long ago that man simply could not solve his problem by imposing his own purposes upon others, Buddha attempted to devise a formula to reduce the pressures and sorrows and miseries which appear to be an essential part of human living. Up to the middle of the 19th century, suffering was regarded as a natural state for man. Religions of ancient times taught man to accept suffering, taught him that in some way suffering was necessary for the maturing of his own soul. To a large degree, these religions did not go into detail. They did not explain the machinery of suffering. They did not really give man any clear insight as to how to escape from the consequences of his own conduct or the pressures of the conducts of persons around him. Religion, therefore, sought to give him a certain solace, a certain hope that somewhere in the vast extent of the universe there was justice, and that if he kept the rules of the universe, he would ultimately come to a better state. Unfortunately, however, down through these ages, no one knew what the rules were that man was supposed to keep. And many very sincere and devout persons broke all the rules. As a result of that, their devotions and their integrities did not prevent them from carrying the burden of suffering. In the 19th century, a scientific humanism arose in Western culture. The purpose of this was to emphasize that man could control, could dominate, could achieve a condition of orientation or integration within this world pattern. Unfortunately, however, this humanism, as it developed, became essentially materialistic. And as a result, the conquest of environment became the ultimate goal. And it was assumed that if man could conquer the things around him and bring them into harmonic relationship with himself, he would be happy. This program has gone on for over 100 years. And as far as we can really discover, man has become in some ways more comfortable, in some matters more secure. The length of life has increased. The probabilities of recovery from various ailments have become better. The standard of living here has risen continuously. Many common ills have been remedied, and many new ills have come into existence. But at the end of 110 years of experimentation, man has not solved the problem of suffering. And in the last 25 years, the impact of his insecurity has come upon him as never before. He suddenly realizes that the whole dream that he had of creating a better world by converting other people, this dream has fallen apart. He is suddenly confronted again with this incalculable number of relationships, these problems which force themselves upon him. And as his communication and transportation systems have improved, and he comes into closer contact with more and more peoples, he becomes ever more concerned as to the securities of his world and the probabilities of his own happiness. So we're really right back where we started from, in a world which we are just as afraid of as our most primordial ancestors. To try to meet this situation in some way or other, we have come to a common agreement among ourselves that we would ignore as long as possible any misfortune that seemed to annoy us. It has become more and more fashionable for the individual not to discuss his troubles, not to mention his problems, but to put on a good face wherever possible, being as cheerful as he could, even if he did not believe it himself. This he has done gradually but consistently for so long that a certain kind of frozen smile is now familiar to us all. It is not a look of security. It is a look of a sort of patterned acceptances. Where the individual does well, everyone applauds. Where he does badly, we all keep quiet. Where we win, we announce it proudly. Where we lose, we say nothing. Where things seem to be going fairly well for a time, we advertise the fact. When things go badly, we keep as quiet as we can and try to keep our miseries to ourselves. At least that is a prevailing tendency. There are some individuals who never kept a misery to themselves yet, but for the most part, it has become a status symbol to carry our distress with dignity. Also, we have developed a great number of escape and defense mechanisms. For a long time, the only way we could keep a good countenance in the presence of some of these problems was to simply bite our lip, get a very strong look on us, and push forward into the unknown. We had a certain amount of willpower. We used it as well as we could. We had a certain number of faculties that would defend us, and we called upon them. And we had certain formulas, little patterns and contrivances, which seemed to make things look better if they were not actually improved. But by the middle of this century, began to realize that we were lazy. The individual no longer had very much interest even in using his own willpower. Willpower to be used meant the individual had to settle down and work with himself. He had to make decisions and keep them. He had to take attitudes and be consistent with them. He had to show a certain amount of continuing courage. He had to have a gracious acceptance of defeat. He had to have a moderate attitude toward success, or he would simply destroy himself by his own excesses. He tried to do this for quite a time. But gradually he became lazy in this, as he becomes lazy in almost everything else. He no longer wanted a long day in which to worry. He wanted a 30-hour week of worry as he wanted a 30-hour week of work. And now he doesn't want any worry at all. So, having little courage, little integration, and practically no self-discipline, many people of the present generation simply can't even carry their own worries with reasonable dignity. So what has happened? We have developed the worry pills. We have developed all kinds of medications, tranquilizers, sedations, stimulants, hypnotic drugs, and almost anything you could think of in the term of inoculation against thinking. It has become now much more fashionable when the individual is in the midst of a problem to take a pill and go to sleep. Unfortunately, however, he wakes up with two problems. The one he originally had and the one caused by the pill. So, actually, we are not gaining too much. But we are desperately striving in some way to beat the combination of circumstances under which we exist. And relentlessly these circumstances win. And we are faced, as Buddha was, with the old question of how we are going to find a working solution that really will work. What we're doing does not operate successfully. The courses that we are now following are very little protection to us when the real emergencies of life begin to close in. So Buddha declared in the fourth of his noble truths what he termed the noble truth of the path that leads to the end of suffering. And he gave a great deal of valuable material. He was the greatest ethical psychologist who ever lived. And in his keeping, information took on a new and wonderful coloring, by means of which he was able to promulgate a belief that profoundly affected the whole life of the Eastern Hemisphere, and is gradually taking greater and greater part in Western thinking. Buddha points out, of course, in the beginning, that the problem that man faces is not the unconquered world, but the unconquered self. That no matter what we do in the externalization of our faculties, we are never going to prevent the great laws of nature from continuing to operate in their eternal way. Even when we get new astronauts out into space or get a telestar out in orbit, the same situations go on in the world. While we are conquering space, the death rate here remains stable or rises. While we are out exploring the mysteries of other dimensions, our crime wave went up 15% last year. While we are out continually struggling to attain these achievements, someone in the United States commits suicide every 20 minutes. This proposition, then, was obvious to Buddha long before there were atomic projectiles contemplated. He knew that in this direction man was only giving himself another sedation. All of this tremendous mass of so-called scientific progress has as its principal objective to cause man to forget that he is failing. Now, this is pretty brutal type of thinking, but somebody has to think this way once in a while, or things go rather badly. We look out and we read the accounts of great progress, and we settle back and we say, things are getting better. Even as we say this, our own personal lives may be moving toward further complications. These vast motions of science or of human ingenuity do not touch the core of the problem. The core of the problem remains with the person, not with the world, but how an individual is going to move quietly and triumphantly through his allotted span here, leaving this world, as far as he is concerned, better than he found it, and leaving him his own life better than it was when it came here. To achieve this end requires a kind of knowledge that man has simply never consistently attempted to attain. Every generation, the individual has been lured away by some policy, some attitude, or some vanity from this tremendous demand for the improvement of himself. So the problem of meeting our daily problems, our daily emergencies, comes back to some kind of a path or a road by means of which we can move through the 60, 70, 80, 90 years of our earthly life with as much dignity, with as great amount of poise and calmness, with as strong and useful a contribution to others as possible, and at the same time to avoid all of these complications by means of which our own existence becomes a misery and our place in society insecure and unsatisfactory. Buddha, of course, being by nature not a theist as we know it, did not dump this problem in the lap of divinity. He did not place all his hope and all his faith upon some providence that was going to solve things regardless of us. He more or less indicated that while man is a creature of immutable and inevitable existence, that man is not destructible in the last analysis, still the position of man at any one given time in the pageantry of his own growth, this position is determined solely and completely by his own conduct. Very hard to get this point across, yet it is one of the most valid points in the history of knowledge, that according to what a man does, so that man is. To try to avoid this with mental or emotional platitudes, with theological formulas, or with tranquilizers, is to miss the essential key to the redemption of human nature. Now, what a man is the sum of his attitudes, his attainments, his habits, his beliefs, his convictions, on all that is in this man. But most of all, perhaps, it is the sum of what he does about what he believes. No amount of belief is valid without action. And action must be consistent with conviction. If it is not, there is no adjustment between the individual and life. From the oldest days of our race, we have had great attitudes. We have had great revelations of knowledge, and we have respected them, but we have seldom made them the principal key to our own conduct. Buddha then tells us that there is one decision that we have to make. And this decision has always faced man and has always been one of the most difficult decisions for him to make. And that is he going to be right or is he going to be fashionable? The individual must decide which is the more important, that he shall conform with the policies around him and thereby come to the same end as those who do conform? Or is he going to conform to the principles within him and come to a more or less individual destiny, determined by his own conduct alone? To most persons, conformity is an essential part of life. They do not dare break away in any major manner from the patterns around them. They fear the disapproval of their associates. They fear the condemnation of society as it is. They do not wish to be out of step. There is a certain instinct to be fashionable, even though being in fashion carries with it a terrible penalty. So in the effort to continue to be adjusted here, the individual loses sight of the need for internal, eternal adjustment within his own character. So Buddha said this particular decision has to be made. The individual cannot successfully serve two masters. He cannot serve those principles which are eternally right, and at the same time live in continual adjustment with those principles which are wrong in terms of eternity. At the same time, he realized, as we all must realize, that no one can go out successfully and wage a one-man revolution against society. We cannot constantly irritate and agitate others with our non-cooperation. We cannot wave flags and make parades and irritate other people without again creating certain unhappiness and inharmony in our own lives. We cannot afford to fall into fanaticism in any form. We cannot afford to be intolerant. We cannot afford to be so shockingly or stressfully different that we make life increasingly difficult for ourselves. So the private problem of each individual is to achieve a certain quiet adjustment with life. One way, of course, to escape most of the major difficulties of living is not to become prominent. The individual who becomes a focus of world attention as a great leader of some nature is bound to be the victim of a terrible confusion of attitudes. And as we have become less discriminating, less thoughtful, we have become more attitude-ridden. There is more criticism, condemnation, and conflict of attitudes today than ever before in history. It has come to a condition now where no one can please anyone, and where absolutely anything we do is going to cause some kind of confusion. We cannot, however, afford to be without some form of constructive activity. Consequently, it becomes increasingly helpful for the person, as Buddha points out in his day, that the individual with the greatest chance of achieving security of life is the person who lives quietly, lives modestly, lives in a cheerful relationship with others, but builds all his dependencies within himself. Thus, to live a comparatively unnoticed existence in which the person's various labors are quietly performed without expectation of approval, this type of existence reduces the probabilities of a head-on collision with a situation we cannot hope to control. So Buddha believes strongly that in the beginning of this path of searching, the person should have a very quiet talk with himself and try to realize more clearly his basic relation with society. Society existed before he came. It will exist after he departs. For most individuals, life is a cycle of activity, of usefulness, of occupation, which is itself only a tiny fragment of world affairs and world events. To live this life, therefore, as quietly and constructively as we can, means that we do not break the basic rules of human relationships. And one of these basic rules is that we are not supposed or intended to dominate other people. We are not supposed or intended to force our will upon others, or to attempt to achieve a condition in which our influence or our authority changes too greatly the lives of others. If we are in executive positions of some kind, this executive right applies almost solely to the conduct of an individual in an enterprise. He is expected to be prompt and punctual. He is expected to do what is required of him. But if the executive begins to intrude upon the private life of his own employees, then he is wrong. And he is taking on a situation, taking advantage of an authority, and will ultimately have a chaotic situation arise around him. So by nature, we are not supposed to take on too great a responsibility in relationship to others. We're supposed to be helpful. We're supposed to be kindly. We're supposed to assist when we are required to assist. If we see opportunities to do things which make life better for other people, it is a gracious privilege. But we have no right to impose upon or move in upon others in a manner with which they resent and which will create responsibilities which will ultimately be painful to ourselves. Actually, one of the reasons why we insist upon trying to take on the lives of others is because it is a psychological symptom, a symbol of the fact that we are unable to control our own destinies. The individual who cannot rule himself seeks to gain a certain consolation by dominating others. And our story of dictators and tyrants through time is the story of individuals with little or no self-control, extroverting their tendencies upon others, forcing others, and in this way seemingly getting a certain negative psychological satisfaction. So in the noble path that leads to the end of suffering, one of the important doctrines is to walk this path very quietly, knowing that this is a path which leads between two extremes that have always been. That the individual moves through society, but he is never really of it. That each individual is himself. That he has certain rules and constructive relationships which he must keep. But that he is constantly to be mindful that he is walking a quiet path, and that this path leads from the way in which he came into this world to the way in which he leaves it. And in between lies this interval of years, and the way in which we administer this interval determines our tranquility of spirit all along the way. Children should be taught this mystery of the quiet attitude toward life. They should be taught that achievement is in terms of inner integration, and not in terms of popularity with others primarily. Yet it is hard to tell children these things because they want to be popular young people. They want to be admired by their own kind. As we get older, we have the same feelings. We want to be admired by those around us. But we pay for this admiration in too great an indebtedness that gradually destroys us. So Buddha tells us very frankly that each person must sometime or other settle into the quiet consideration of his own need. That this is not selfishness, but this is the way nature intended it to be, and whatever nature intends, we cannot condemn or complain about. If nature hadn't wanted us to do it that way, nature would reward us for other kinds of action. But nature rewards us only for the magnificent power and achievement by which we learn to mind our own business. This is nature's decree, and against this we have no recourse. So to begin life, or to come into life at any point of insight, with a strong desire to be non-competitive in living, to escape as far as we can from all the artificialities of conduct, to get out of the popular tendency to copy our own living from other people, to attempt to be successful as they are successful, to look prosperous as they look prosperous, and to take on the common debt which they have taken on. Let's quietly live a purposeful existence. To gain a purposeful existence, we have to have purposes in our own consciousness. We have to have values which make life interesting, important, and valuable. To gain these insights within ourselves means that we have to attain some kind of educated understanding. Education in this case does not necessarily imply schooling, although it may. But it does imply that the person develops strong, directing interests within himself. That these interests are such as are not likely to cause pain. That these interests are such as are not likely to require either dishonesty or compromise. That the person, therefore, gains the ability to be interested in values. The more he accomplishes this, the more serene and self-directive his own life will be. His pleasures should be the pleasures by which his own mind, emotion, consciousness are enriched. His interests should be such as are non-destructive, non-critical, non-divisional. The person thus has to have a rich inner life, or else he has to turn upon society for something to think about. And the person who has to depend for his rich inner life upon the newspaper and the television is in a very poor state. If he has nothing to think about that makes life richer, that makes his own purposes clearer, he is in a lamentable state, because the only attitudes he is going to get from others around him will not serve him in any useful capacity. Out of listening to television for years, he may come in the end to an honorable hatred for it, which is no important achievement for himself. He is moving through this world in a tremendous opportunity to grow, and he is bogged down. He is completely hemmed in by attitudes, by acceptances and rejections which have no meaning. If then this type of problem is in our lives, and it is in many lives, the need for an interesting existence becomes obvious. Most homes need interesting values. They do not have them. Most young people are brought up in uninteresting homes. They are brought up in an environment in which there are no strong, powerful happy values. Instead of these values, there is only excitement as a way of trying to block man's natural hunger for good food. When a man is hungry, it's very little use to give him a bowl of condiments. He wants nutritional food. When he is in problem, there is no use simply trying to cause him to forget this problem in an excitement of some kind. The answer lies in having the information available which solves the problem. One of the things with us today is that we are a very bored people. And because we are bored in a mysterious way, we live upon excitements which do not solve any of our real needs. So the person who wishes to have the useful, quiet, non-competitive life must turn more and more to himself and to those most immediately associated with him in the construction of better values. And in the construction of better values, we know that they must take the form of dynamic, creative interests and appreciations. The person should not, in the few years which are allotted to him here, be forced to wish these years would pass faster. He should not merely live from day to day, hoping that tomorrow will be better than today. Nor should he count with joy the passing years because they are shortening the era of his problem. These attitudes are fatalistic and negative. Yet most persons do not know how to break through this kind of an impasse. One way in which it is done, and has been done successfully, is for someone in the midst of this general lack of values to suddenly demand value, to go and look for it, to start a new activity in their own lives, which activity has some consistent value meaning. Now, wherever we start something, we also come upon decisions. For when we attempt any activity under our present economic system, we have to expect a certain amount of expense. Now, the average person has a budget which he has to keep. He cannot begin to do all the things he wants to do. This is one of his troubles. He doesn't realize that if he did them all, he would be in worse condition than he is now. He always feels that he could be happy if other things came to him that he wants. But in the determination of a life of value, each person has to determine, according to his own insight, what he wants to do with what he has. Therefore, he must make a series of calculated sacrifices. He must sacrifice certain status symbols around him for the achievement of the values he wants inside himself. He must determine whether he wants to use what he has to create a more attractive environment around him, or whether he wishes to use it to make a more attractive environment within him. Now, he may be able, in a moderate way and through careful thinking, to achieve something of both. But when we start today thinking about the individual improving himself, we know that he has to make decisions somewhere along the line. And one of the most important decisions is, what is he willing to give up in order to be happy? Not what does he want to have, but what can he get along without? And usually he gets rather confused on this point. But if he wishes to expend more for his own culture, then he must give up certain other things which he has accepted as external symbols of success. Is he going to be a better person, or is he still going to continue to try to be an example of success in his neighborhood? Buddha long ago taught the gradual reduction of the unnecessary. to think of everything that we do and everything that we have in terms of its value to our consciousness, and not in terms merely, for instance, of its labor-saving implications. Among other things which came in with the early 20th century lassitude was laziness. The average person today is much more concerned in buying leisure than almost any other thing that is offered for sale. He buys a faster car so he can get where he wants to go more rapidly if the freeways permit. He begins to buy frozen packaged foods in vast quantities. He pays 3 times as much for what he gets, but he feels that it is well worthwhile if he saves 15 minutes of labor. He is constantly trying to save labor and energy. But for what reason? For no good and proper end. For the reason he has nothing to do with the time that he saves. If the time that he saved was of the greatest importance to the development of his own nature, it might be well for him to pay 10 times as much for the processed foods. But he has no value from them. The leisure that he is gaining is meaningless. In many cases, it is only more time in which to be miserable. But this leisure is a status symbol. If we have nothing to do, we are an aristocrat. If we have to work, we are a proletarian. And no matter how democratic we get politically, we still believe in the aristocracy of idleness as the symbol of superiority. This idleness would be wonderful if we used it in which to do great creative work. But then it would not be idleness anymore. It would merely be a new area of activity. But unless we have a stronger cultural life than we have at the present time, we have simply no way of using the time that we save. So if we are going to use these devices to simplify living, we are by responsibility required to take this time that we save and make this time valuable. And the only way in which we can make time valuable is to use it to grow with. And growth means gradual victory over problem. And a growth that does not contribute to the solution to problem is not growth. The main thing that an individual should be able to take with him out of this life at the end of it is a conscious, full realization of achievement. That this individual knows that in departing from this world, he knows more, has become more, understands better, and has become more completely adjusted by his own effort as the result of having lived here. If he does not go out of this life with a sense of greater internal achievement, then life, as far as he is concerned, has been a failure, regardless of his bank account or his estate holdings. Most people go out of this life pretty well discouraged. And this is due largely to the fact that they have not invested sufficient time or energy in the cultivation of their own natures. Man must then sit down quietly and say to himself, in my life, in my problem, what is the cause of pain? What are the things that hurt me? What is it that makes life disagreeable? Why is it that we can't get up in the morning with a smile, go through the day with reasonable contentment of spirit, and go to rest with a sense of achievement? What is between us and these naturally desirable attitudes? What is it that hurts us? Now, with each person, there is a little difference in the answers, because each individual has gotten himself involved in a different kind of problem. And so he has to say very definitely in self-analysis, what is my problem? What is my hurt? What is it that happens to me continuously that makes life less than it should be? And we come up with all kinds of different answers if we're honest. And in most cases, there are probably several contributing factors to our lack of happiness. Perhaps one of the factors that we observe if we are very thoughtful is jealousy. Perhaps all through life we have allowed jealousy to hurt us, to break our homes, to alienate our children, to leave us friendless. If jealousy is our problem, then jealousy is for us a cause of suffering. And while this remains, we will never recover from the suffering. We like to hope or believe that other people should understand us, should be patient with us, and should forgive us. But if we are jealous, we do not understand them, we are not patient with them, and we do not forgive them. Thus we are locked in an attitude or a group of attitudes, and we can demand from others nothing that we do not give ourselves. So if such a problem as this does burden us, then we must gradually resolve this problem. Not several other problems, but this one. We should not go to others and try to have them accept our jealousies as proper and natural, nor should we say, well, after all, we're only human. This is boasting in the majority of cases. What we should do is to know that jealousy is a cause of suffering, and that the only way in which we can end suffering is by ceasing to be jealous. Now, one of the answers to this would explain many other problems, so we can use one example for many different detailed applications. Jealousy requires certain factors in order to operate. First of all, it must include some way within it a certain resentment against the achievements of others. This resentment may simply mean only one thing, that we have not been sufficiently industrious to attain our own achievement, and therefore become jealous of others. It may also be that the things of which we are jealous are of no importance. What we may not know is that the person of whom we are jealous is miserable with the things about which we are jealous. We are jealous because this person has more than we have, and he is looking at us jealous of the fact that we have fewer responsibilities than he has. All of these things are attitudes. And where jealousy involves things which are non-eternal, which are in themselves passing or inevitable, or a part of this passing world in which we live, then the problem is to gain enough insight to realize that they're not worth being jealous of. Most people are jealous of things that have no value. But they have developed these habits of wanting things that are of no value. So the person must quietly decide how is he going to get over being jealous. Perhaps he has never really thought of it before, but he needs insight. And the only way that he can probably gain this insight is through a moderate amount of study, a certain amount of good reading, a familiarity with the great ideals of the world, and a gradually increasing respect for the most valuable and proper of all convictions, those which have to bear upon the life he lives. So one of the things we all have to do the moment we want to change or make any adjustment in our nature is to develop some new insight concerning a philosophy of life. The word philosophy in this world has become a very unpleasant word, a word signifying a great deal of heavy mentation. But the fact remains it is still the most necessary word we know. For without some philosophy, no individual can escape suffering. Philosophy, of course, does not affirm itself as a panacea of suffering. It does not promise to end all suffering. But it can and does show us the road that leads to the end of suffering. So every person who wants to be better than he is must gain a better insight into the laws governing human conduct and relationship. He will get this only, in the most part, from solid and sincere sources of information. There is a vast amount of wasted reading in this country. There are a great many people who are reading books which conflict with each other, or trying to study systems of ideas which are incompatible even with the parts of themselves. This leads to further confusion and misery. And in the search for authority, it is always wise for the person to decide upon that which is the best which is known, and to remain with that which has been proven or sustained by thousands of years of human experience. Various passing ideas that move in and out of our lives too rapidly cannot be trusted in these heavy emergencies. Also, any line of thinking, any belief or attitude which has a tendency to try to make shortcuts, or to make it too easy, or to cause man for one moment to lose sight of the fact that his destiny is in his own hands, and that his salvation must be earned by his own right efforts. Anything that tries to compromise this or substitute something else should be viewed with the greatest and most continuing suspicion. So a little philosophy in that spare time that is saved by the frozen dinners will help. It will cause the individual to do something with the time he has saved. If he is not doing any more than watching some television program, he might as well peel the potatoes himself. Why should he pay for someone to help him to waste his own time? But if he has something better to do, then perhaps with a good conscience, he can say, if it costs 10 cents more to let somebody else peel them, it's worth it, because I'm doing something that no one else can do for me. So the thing we want to pay for is what no one else can do for us but ourselves. And for this we can make sacrifice of other things. So we take some time for the development of various means of enriching our own thinking and our own emotions. Enrich them in every way that we can, and gain the tranquility which comes from better personal orientation. If we can work with this slowly, we will find that as we become better people, that it will become easier for us to control negative expressions of our own conduct or fears that may arise within us. The end, of course, is a tranquil existence. Tranquility does not mean non-event. Tranquility simply means that the individual moves through events with understanding. And as the result of understanding them, the power of event to hurt is reduced and sometimes entirely eliminated. We are hurt by the unknown, the unfair, and the unreasonable. When we understand life, these no longer have influence over us, and we are able to plan our own destinies accordingly. And we go further and further along in this road which leads to the end of suffering. We also come nearer and nearer to the contemplative mysteries of life. We come to the realization of the tremendous dignity of quiet leisure. We realize the importance of permitting life to express through ourselves. We slowly discover a tremendous creativity within, a creativity which brings with it far more of happiness and far more of achievement than anything we can force on it from the outside. So out of our gradual organization of our affairs, there should come a certain simplification. Simplification is in most instances only the elimination of that which is worthless. And by gradually attaining simplification, we begin fighting for time to be used well rather than to be wasted. And one of the good uses of time is quiet contemplation. Now, contemplation is not merely sitting down somewhere for 5 minutes and trying to commune with the infinite. Contemplation is a continual usage of life symbolism for the enrichment of character. Contemplation is meaningful seeing, meaningful hearing, meaningful contact through the senses, and finally, meaningful organization of the consequences of sensory function. I think the answer to that, of course, is clearly told to us in Buddha's machine of the sixth sensory perception. These perceptions are constantly bringing in testimony. But what does the testimony mean? What do we learn through the senses? We are not using an instrument that is exactly like a camera that can only record the thing that it sees or meets its sensory need. Yet there is this recording process. Yet merely to record events without any evaluation of these events, without any effort to understand the meaning of event, when we allow this to happen, we lose the entire message which nature is attempting to convey to us. For all events mean something. All events have an origin in a cause, and this cause must be consistent with the event. All events in turn become causes, and from them in turn pour other sequences of effects. All of the testimony of everyday living, everything that happens to us, the smallest thing, the answering of the telephone or the doorbell, all of these experiences are recorded to us by our sensory perception, are taken to the sixth sensory coordinate, the mind, and here they are organized in terms of meaning. It is not sufficient that the mind be a kind of recording machine. We do not want to merely someday pick up the tape and play it back. We want something more than that out of the mind. We want the mind to be accurate, but we want it to be meaningful. Whenever something is discovered or experienced, the question is, what does it mean? What mystery does it solve? How does it give us a better insight into the universal purpose? How will it help us to correct mistakes that we make? So in the case of the mind, which is completely untutored, we have at best merely an accurate record of events. But it is within the power of the mind to have ideas. It is the power of the mind to have creative reaction to the things that the senses bring to its attention. Thus, the mental faculty transforms things observed into meaning, and in this way enriches experience. If these messages are not permitted to come through, or if the mind simply says, that's that, and turns over to other or less useful occupations, then nothing happens. The individual experiences and gains nothing. He sees every day important things and they mean nothing to him. He can go through a life which warns him 1,000 times of his own mistake and he will never even notice the warning. So unless this mental instrument in some way functions as a rationalizer, it has no value to him. To enable it to so function, it must be further instructed. The information that comes through the sensory perceptions must include cultural and ethical information. Just as the eye brings him the sight of things seen, so the eye brings him the word on the printed page. Just as surely as the ear brings him the record of the confused noise of a city, so the ear also brings to him great music, brings to him great words, great ideas, through various media of communication. So that these faculties have to contribute more in order that the mental coordinator may have enlightenment as well as information. When the coordinator begins to use information correctly, and we begin to have creative interpretation of things which have happened, then the mind also begins to come up with certain conclusions, certain reasonable and proper findings about things. And the mind becomes a kind of honorable judge, reviewing evidences and finally bringing in the verdict of the case. Now, the judge, in order to operate in this way successfully, must be honest and impartial. So the coordinator, in order to function, must not be overstressed by the preconceptions of the individual through whom the mind is operating. If we say to the mind, you can bring in any decision you want as long as it agrees with what I want, the mind is immediately paralyzed. Its function ceases. As an interpreter of value, it becomes worthless, because it must provide only that which the consciousness makes it possible for it to provide. So in order for the mental coordinator to have value, it must function without ulterior pressure from the personality. It must not be bribed or threatened. It must not be turned from the proper civic course of honor. If it is, then there is no longer any value in it, and we simply continue to live by building more prejudices that hurt us more and more. That the coordinator may bring in reasonable evidence means that we must be quietly attentive to the various discoveries that are made by our own intellection. We must be quietly receptive, protecting the coordinator, and also naturally inquiring as to the best of meaning. This is a contemplative procedure in which quietly we review, analyze, consider meaning, so that meaning will become continuously more valuable to us. And as we become more and more addicted to meaning, we find the quest for it a most happy and joyous occasion. We find that it is perfectly possible to spend a quiet evening with ourselves, exploring meaning, making discovery after discovery of interest, value, and often of the greatest pleasure to ourselves. We also can find that such times, occasionally well spent, give us courage and insight into the solution of problem, and the solution of problem leads to the end of suffering. We learn early in this procedure that an ulterior attitude is fatal. That the moment we permit ourselves to be moved by that which is not honest, not honorable, not right, we set in motion causations which lead to suffering. Everything that goes wrong with us has to in some way arise from mistakes that we have made. We cannot change some of these happenings. We may have to endure them as cheerfully and as wisely as we can, but we can cease causing more like them. And by reducing the errors, reduce the penalties. Contemplation is therefore the extraction of meaning. Contemplation, if it is honest, is also a period of time that is non-karmic. In contemplation, we are not doing the wrong thing all the time. In contemplation also, we are building new values, which will assist us to protect decisions which we will make in the future. Buddha points out that this discrimination process must become habitual. We are not supposed to spend the rest of our lives carefully watching our own minds. We are supposed to set up good mental habits to take the places of the bad mental habits that we have permitted to dominate. It is not any more necessary for us to have habits of selfishness than it is for us to have good habits of unselfishness. Selfishness is mostly a habit. It is a simple pattern which we have been taught even by our own forebears to cultivate. We are told that the world will take care of the individual who is selfish enough to take care of himself. But we are not told how the world takes care of him. And in the majority of cases, it just tucks him away in a miserable conclusion to his life. Thus, the cultivation of natural habits that are good will relieve the person of any sense that he is trying to be good or trying to be wise. He is simply being himself. He has simply accepted good habits as good for him, and he is living them. And when that which is not good arises, he just will not accept it as he used to. And once he has demanded a certain standard from his own thinking, the thinking will give it to him. But if allowed to do exactly as it pleases, with no help from character or purpose, thinking will not lead the individual to security. It will lead him into innumerable byways of tragedy. Contemplation naturally leads then to the organization of purposed planning. The individual who has certain convictions that are now strong within him will arrange his affairs as far as he can in order that these convictions may have a chance. He will give more effort, time, thought, and consideration to conviction than he did in the past. He will plan the kind of life which will give him the greatest amount of personal growth in terms of his own need. This kind of life is the kind which will gradually bring him to security, will bring him to the end of suffering. Buddha's position, of course, goes considerably further than this. He believes that the end of suffering must ultimately come from the gradual dying out of the personal equation in our lives. But he also is fully aware that this process is a slow one, and if arbitrarily forced upon the individual, is as dangerous as the mistakes that he is making. But it is also evident that as man gradually accepts value, gradually accepts universal law, and gradually dedicates himself to the advancement of those ends which do not belong in this world primarily, that his life here should rather graciously simplify itself. His life here is simply an area of time set aside for the experiencing of certain values. And almost all of these values are centered around the negative polarity that worldliness is not the answer. He must find this out. He must finally discover it fully and completely. If he does not, he will never escape. If, however, he quietly, lovingly, and wisely improves himself day by day, he outgrows worldliness as he outgrows the tempests of his own adolescence. He achieves to a maturity, and this maturity is a gentle, self-disciplined existence. It is a kind of existence in Zen. where good things become perfectly natural to the person, where quietude, gentleness, and law and order are the way we want to live, not the way forced upon us in an effort to get over some neurotic situation. The only way to get over neurosis is to cause it to die out in its root. It will not die any other way. You can cut off the leaves and branches forever, but if the root remains there, it will grow again. And the root of neurosis is selfishness. And as long as that remains, you are not going to get rid of the result. According to Buddha, the universe is largely sustained upon the core of selfishness. And selfishness doesn't always mean that we want things. Selfishness may only mean a certain kind of negative self-centeredness, the wrong kind. The kind that tries to draw things to us from the outside, rather than causing the inside to open up and release us from self-will, self-purpose, and self-consciousness as we know it. So Buddha points out that relaxing away from these pressures of self-interest, causes us to relax away from suffering. That the person does not die normally of the full exhaustion of his powers. He dies as the result of the destruction of his own attitudes. He has destroyed tissue, he has destroyed energy, he has wasted life. Also, through the course of years, while there are some ailments and ills that we know no solution for at the present time, the majority of our difficulties arise from our own mistakes. And if we cease making these mistakes, we cease causing suffering. If we do not any longer cause suffering, we give release to that part of ourselves which is important. Although Buddha did not declare his belief in a personal deity, he also strongly affirmed that he was not an atheist, and therefore that his primary concern was actually to give a kind of universal consciousness a chance to manifest itself. That as long as the individual is locked in this small conspiracy of thoughts and desires, whatever be the reality in him, whatever be the inevitable meaning and purpose of his existence, these cannot be known. He can exist only for the continuous perpetuation of his own attitudes and mistakes. If he does this, he will not only suffer in this life, but in many lives to come. If, however, in the gradual unfolding of his own internal, he reaches a condition in which life itself, consciousness itself in its highest sense, the real being within us, is able to gradually manifest itself in our conduct, gradually moving out from its own root to prepare in us a place of habitation for itself. If we can get this inner life moving from within toward our external, we are in the presence of a great remedial agency. We are in the presence of the self as instructor and as liberator. And this type of attainment has such value, such permanence, such meaning, that nothing else is important when compared with it. But in order to attain the real, the unreal must gradually be eliminated. Man will always attempt to find reality in the wrong things until these wrong things cease to interest him, cease to concern him, cease to dominate his thinking and his believing. So in the path of suffering, we have a gradual slowing down of these false intensities which lead to pain, and a gradual release of that internal integrity which cannot cause pain and which cannot be the cause of evil. If we can make this adjustment, for we will ultimately win. But it sounds difficult, and for most people it is difficult. Not because it is really hard to achieve, but because the mind of the individual builds tremendous obstacles against it. It should not be impossible for man to give up suffering. There seems to be no reason why he should want to be miserable. Nor does there seem to be any reason why he should build his entire culture on the concepts which make misery inevitable. There seems to be nothing about this whole pattern of misfortune that should cause it to be so enticing, so satisfactory, that the individual clings desperately to it. It is very much as though an alcoholic was trying desperately to justify the fact that he must drink. He knows it doesn't do him any good. He knows it will probably ultimately destroy him, but he resists every effort of those around him to cure his condition. So it does not seem, as Buddhists thought so long ago, that there is any reason why man should choose this desperately difficult and painful way of living. Somewhere along the line he has to change or extinguish his kind. This does not mean that he will cease, but that he will be moved into some kind of a different environment where the attitudes and patterns which now exist can no longer affect him in this way. He may fail there also, but there is no reason why he has to fail. There's no reason why this universe should be geared only to pain. There should be some way in which it can be geared to joy, to success, and to happiness in those things which are truly valuable. If man relaxes and gets away from his self-centeredness, true love becomes easy to him. True faith becomes possible for him. True insight becomes a natural heritage. These are the values that he has to have. Now each person has to take hold of this problem somewhere. He has to arise from some emergency in which he is disillusioned with his own mistakes. It's about the only break that ever comes in his armament. And when he has such an experience, he must try to build value upon it. He must keep for a time a vigilant guard upon his own errors. He must purposefully, intentionally, and willingly use his own strength of character. If this strength is not great enough, he must also build this strength. He must give his attention to these values which will help him to live a happier and more normal life. If he will do it, even for a few months, the results will be immediately noticeable. If an individual will curb his tongue for 3 months, his life will be a much better life. And he will know it. But he cannot seem to get around to doing it. He will suffer from many other causes. He will go through a serious hospitalization. He will waste money and time trying to get over something. But he will not voluntarily change himself. The only way that you can help him to do this is to give him, as far as we can, the best of his racial heritage of thought and understanding, to present him with these principles and these laws continuously, hoping that gradually they will become part of his subconscious and work into his nature and become a living equation in his life. Through constant exposure to these things, through constantly increasing attention, through increasing interest in better things, the person is moved little by little into this more desirable condition. Now it's hard, for instance, to say that if we should, in a moment of great personal effort, perhaps overcome a bad trait, even for a short time, it is impossible to say what the consequence of this will be. It may be that this one small effort that we have made can in the future change pain into peace. We have to build with something. We not only have to build for here, but we have to build for the fact that this is not our world, primarily, and that what we are goes with us into other places. We have to prepare for this eternal existence with self. And unless we achieve this victory, this eternal existence becomes an endless pageantry of pain. Why do we want to be unhappy? Why do we desperately persecute and crucify those who have tried to help us to understand happiness? Why do we relentlessly go on our way? The only answer that Buddha could find out for it was selfishness. That in us locked is this self-entity that above all good wishes to do as it pleases. And because it is not informed, and because it is not educated, it does not please to do what is right. Thus we have to educate it. We have to educate it in values, not in the schooling we get here, but in education in life perspective itself. All education in relation to these things must bring relaxation, relaxing of the self. The fact that we are no longer defending it every moment subconsciously. The fact that we are no longer constantly aware that somebody else is trying to insult it from here on to the end of time. To reduce this tremendous intensity of selfness. To reduce the pressure to react to the defense of an insulted or irritated self. This problem of trying to see into things instead of assuming the worst part of everything. This continuous expectation that others will understand us, but that we do not need to understand them. This type of attitude has always afflicted us. It seems to be a built-in factor of our existence. And yet we cannot win while this factor remains. Some way has got to be found to get rid of it. And one of the ways that nature operates is by placing us in the very insecurities we are in today. Frightened, worried, doubtful. Because we have failed to develop those faculties which would give us the power to dominate constructively a world situation or prevent it. Not having this insight, we go on our way. But in every generation there are some to whom this insight comes as the result of suffering. For that is the cause for all of it in the first place. For suffering is an effect that must cause the individual to ultimately seek for release. To meet this type of causation, we have to get rather quiet with ourselves and perhaps learn to bless suffering. Learn to accept it for what it is, the ever benevolent reminder of our own need. When we can accept suffering as a teacher, perhaps then we can learn to learn from that teacher. Perhaps if instead of rebelling against circumstance, we regard circumstance forever as instruction, then perhaps we can accept this instruction. But the end of suffering for every individual is the end of a pattern of mistakes that can never succeed. And in the place of these mistakes, the development of the gracious, kindly kind of life, a life dedicated to value, to beauty, to friendship, to kindness, to simple things, to moderate requirements, and to refraining from those excesses of attitude which must inevitably lead to suffering. As we quiet down, as we release, as we organize, as we integrate, as we gradually come to recognize the graciousness of a possible life lived with insight, then by degrees suffering ceases. The small problems go first naturally, but the greater ones follow because they are all based upon the same mistakes. And once we know this, we can begin the road or get firmly established on the path that does lead to the end of suffering. For the end of suffering is nothing more than the individual awaking to the fact that life is wonderful. Life is beautiful. Life is good. Change is good. Responsibilities are good. Death is good. When we find these good things underneath the desperate defenses we have built against living, we can relax and live, fully aware that we are living in a universe of high purposes which can only communicate to us when we love it, and will never communicate to us when we hate it or fear it. But when we love it, it opens up. And in our definite acceptances and our faithful allegiances, we show our true regard. To find this end of suffering, therefore, is to find the beginning of the love of instruction, the love of doing things better, the love of doing things beautifully as we are endowed to do them, and to use our faculties to bring peace rather than to bring war. We all have to find this out for ourselves, and when we do find it out, we have the mystery of suffering, and we can rise above it and come to a better way of life. Well, I guess time is up, so we'll let's just pause again.